This is the last of the four-part series, everyone. Pastor Matt's idea was for us to have a series where we talked about verses that had meant a lot to us. And so I knew that the first one I was going to preach on was about my struggle to be a United Methodist pastor in a church where education was a huge requirement. Today is this verse from Romans, and it says to us that if we will yield ourselves to God, we will experience the fullness of His transformation. This is just 5 simple points I want to just walk through briefly with you today about these 2 verses from Romans. First of all, he says to the church in Rome, please present your bodies as a living sacrifice, because in the ancient world there was a practice known as Gnosticism. And the idea was that if you wanted to have salvation, eternal salvation, all you had to have was the right knowledge. And so when Jesus comes along and gives His life on the cross to redeem us, people got to the place they said, all you have to do is believe in Jesus. That's all you have to do, and you will be saved. And I grew up in that kind of an atmosphere when I was in my 16, 17, 18-year-old days of knowing that I wanted to be saved. I didn't want to be lost. I wanted to be saved and go to heaven someday, and so I embraced that. But the Gnostics in the early first century were saying to the first Christians, you don't have to worry about what you do with your body. All you have to do is have the knowledge. Paul is turning that whole philosophy upside down. And then he says something that's almost hard to comprehend. He says the way you take care of your body, the way you live your life in the world, is a form of worship. We tend to think that worship is what we do here in a sanctuary. But Paul is saying worship is not limited to a sanctuary. He's saying that the way you live your life when you go out those doors today is truly spiritual worship. Then he goes on to say, don't be conformed to this world. He's saying the world teaches things like, if somebody hits you on the right cheek, hit them back. That's what the world would say. That's not what those who would make themselves disciples of Jesus Christ would say. Jesus said in His Sermon on the Mount, if somebody hits you on the right cheek, turn and give them the left also. In other words, Jesus is saying you got to change the way you think. And this is what the second and the fourth point of my message this morning is. If you don't want to be buying in to the ways of this world, which are in contradiction to the ways of Christ, you must be transformed. And how do you get transformed? By the renewing of your mind. Now, Rick Warren, in one of his devotions, said this. He says, the battle for sin starts in your mind, not in your behavior. The way you think determines the way you feel, and the way you feel determines the way you act. If you want to change the way you act, you start by changing the way you think. In addition, if you want to change the way you feel, you must start with changing the way you think. The way you think affects how you live your life. And while those verses of Romans 12, 1 and 2 were so significant in my early years as a teenager and as a young adult, I want you to know that today they're even more important because I'm realizing that all those people who invested in me were doing me a wonderful favor. I am blessed because of the way that people challenge me to change my thinking. I have a friend, a very good friend, a colleague in ministry. His name is Jack. He said he served a church here in our state, and he said he's also been a person, and I'm not ashamed to tell you that I'm a person who is very outspoken about believing that everybody should be welcome at the Lord's table, not just welcome, but included, full inclusion. I believe in the full inclusion of all people, whether they're gay, straight. I believe that. This friend was telling me this story. He said, my last church I served before I retired, there was a fellow in my congregation who disagreed with me about full inclusion. And he said, and I respected him and he respected me. But he was always saying, preacher, I just want you to know I don't agree with what you're saying. And he called me one day, and he said, "Preacher, are you at the church?" I said, "Yeah, I am." He said, "Do you have a few minutes?" And he said, "Sure." So he comes by, and he walks in his office, and he sits down, and he says, "We need to talk." I said, "Okay." He says, "You know how I've been opposed to you all this time about inclusion and gay marriage and so forth?" He said, "Yeah, I know." He said, "We need to talk." He said, "My son called me the other day, and he told me, 'Dad, I think that I'm gay.'" Not only do the things that influence us about the teachings of the gospel and the love of Christ and the compassion that Christ had for all people, not only do those things change us, but our experiences also change us. I think that sometimes we have to stop and look and be honest with ourselves and honest with each other and say, "God, what is your will?" And that's where I come to the last part of this. As we go through this and realizing that we don't want to be conformity, but we don't want to be opposed to Christ. We want to be transformed by the way of Christ. We want to think differently, and we want the mind of Christ to be in us. Changing the way you think can be a very tough task in life. Paul says in here that we should learn to renew our minds so that they can be transformed. If I want to discover that which is good and that which is perfect in God's sight, I've got to be willing to read the Bible, to listen to what it's saying, to listen to what the Spirit thinks, because here's what's the bottom line here, my friends. We're either going to be conformed by the world or we're going to be renewed by God. Those two forces are at work in this world. And you have to make a choice as to who you want to shape your life and project your destiny. Follow Jesus, and you won't go wrong. Weigh everything that other people tells you in the light of how that lines up with the teachings of Jesus Christ.